Welcome. This is the OTT spaces here in Wypern, and we here with knowledge, experience, and good practice, and some discovery that we made. So for today, my name is Jose Liendro, and today I want to share knowledge about how to run integration tests and DB migration from pipelines, in particular through AWS CodePipeline and GitHub Action. If you like, please subscribe and give us a like. That will help us always. And so for today, I wrote this agenda. And so there are 5 main points that I can group. And so if I want to go to the main points here, I would like to say that the mechanisms and features that we will talk are related to improve the code delivery and the code quality. And it will help in the automation process and improve the maintenance of all the environments that we have on the client side. It can reduce the deployment time as well. We will see some that we can use as well will help to improve error handling, since we can go directly to the error that's happened and resolve as quick as possible the error that we can face on a public environment. And finally, improve the communications to all the team that some release was done in some in particular environments. So if we go deep in each of these points, if we go to the first one, to improve the code quality and code delivery, that what we want to do here is to avoid known errors, the ones that every time that if we are following good practices, we used to create unit tests, integration tests. So in the daily basis, we are writing those tests, or is desired to have those. And so the problem here is how can we include those? How can we include them in our deployment process so we are safe that the code that we are delivering is going through that process and we are in a healthy path, at least for all the known or the main designs that we have. And as well, we can say something similar about the dependencies, since our code can use a dependency that could be out of date and in particular could have some vulnerabilities. We want to, as well in the pipeline process, in the deployment process, to be aware if some dependencies have some vulnerabilities that can affect the whole application. On the other hand, we in the same way, each of our environments can have like different databases. So could be at some point when we have multiple environments and feature environments to have the difficulty to maintain the schedule of all those database and seeds. So as well, these kind of mechanisms will have to maintain a different feature environment with different DB schemas. In part of the automation, well, it's what we talk. Every time that we have a kind of POC and a feature environment where we have testing a new feature, probably we'll have a new table, new columns, or whatever that's not ready to go to a public environment like in a stable branch like staging. So it's safer to give to all the team the options to maintain their DB schema every time that they are running a deployment. Then about the test, if you notice, when we are running integration test, we need to have a test DB. So usually the integration tests are slower than the unit test, and maybe can take like 10 minutes to run. And if we are adding all these layers into the deployment process, we want to reduce the time. So we will cover a yard strategy. So we can do a parallelism to run the integration test, and also to avoid to download again and again the dependencies or the Docker images that we need to have in the deployment process. And finally, no matter the pipeline that we are using, will be very nice if we have a good communication through the whole team. So if we deploy something to a feature environment, no matter if we are working or not, we are aware about, well, some feature was deployed, or if it has some failure, so some bug, as well, we will be aware about that. So that is the general agenda. I will try to go as fast as possible to cover them. but let me know or if you have any questions. So we are going together. And so let's start with the diagrams that I made for today. So this is at least my main general scope in a daily basis with my current client, where I have this, we have these main branches like development, staging, and main. And sometimes when we want to work in a POC or in a feature environment to test some functionality that has a different DB schema, we are creating a feature branch. And here probably we will need to have a DB schema. So behind those we probably have a public environment. So arriving to, in example, we will use in AWS to store our application. And in order to go to those applications on this cloud provider, we have pipelines. And during this example, we will see how to manage through GitHub Actions or AWS CodePipeline. There are flavors of type of pipelines that we will talk in the presentation. So this is the scope. We have branch, pipelines, and cloud providers. So we will go here in this neighborhood in the pipelines. As I said, we have GitHub Actions and code pipelines in AWS. And as you see here, there's a detail about a Docker container, which is the DB schema, the test database that we will use for the integration tests. So we will know how each of these pipelines manage and give us the options to this test database to run our integration tests. Then, okay. So because we are talking about pipelines, I think one of the starting point here will be how to create them. No matter if we choose GitHub Actions or code pipeline, we need to write the pipeline in a YAML file. And if we go to their UI, here on top, we have the GitHub Actions UI. And at the bottom, we have how AWS code pipeline looks like. So here, I'm not sure if you can see, I will try to zoom in a little bit. If we go in the first option in GitHub Action, if we want to see how the process goes, we will see something like this where we have a set of jobs that they are related to some order between them. So in this case, in the first option, we are running integration test, the audit dependency, and the integration test like a first layer. And then if everything goes right, then we will deploy the application to AWS. In the other option, in the other side here, in a code pipeline, I'm not sure if you are aware about the service that in AWS, we have a couple of services. The main one is a code pipeline that is pretty similar to GitHub Actions. And instead of having these jobs, we will have the unit will be the build. So for this code pipeline, we have a set of build specs that each one has some definitions. So what we are seeing here is a stage where we are running the integration test, the unit test, the yarn audit in a first layer. When we are sure about everything was going fine, then we can start running the process to run the migrations and seeds. So in this process, we will deploy in new columns, new tables, delete some fields and wherever. And finally, when we prepare the team and seeds, we will deploy the application. If we are in a AWS side, what we will do is to deploy the CloudFormation template. And so far, so good. If we want to see what is the current status of a deployment, it's a matter to go to GitHub or AWS, and we can see this kind of result and see if it was successful or not. But in daily basis, what is more useful is to create the integration with Slack or whatever chat that you are using or tool. So we can aggregate all those results and send it to a kind of channel where we are aware about all these deployments and how it goes. So these are examples about how it looks in the daily basis, at least in my current client, where we have a notification, and this is a happy path that we have For a deployment, we have two options. The top one is how the code pipelines notify Slack about a new deployment. There are a lot of options when we are doing the integration. So what we are seeing here is what we attach to some events. We want to know when a deployment started, and then we want to know if the deployment was successful. So the happy path will be to receive two notifications that saying some deployment started in some environment. In this case, we are seeing an environment with the name demo. So a deployment was started and then it was complete. So that is one thing. So behind this deployment, we know that since we talked, we know that when this happened, all the integration tests, unit tests, yarn audit, and the migration are done. So the only thing that we need to do is to then go to the environment demo and just test our feature and say to the client, well, you can go here and you will have one. The same thing will happen with GitHub. There are different ways to do this integration, but with both options, we can have as well a channel that receives a notification from Slack, that someone happened through an environment. The second option will be to like an unhappy path where someone failed, right? So this is the way that we have notification in Slack that say the opposite. The deployment failed, and here in message we are seeing like two things were failing in this deployment: the unit test and the integration test, in particular the yard number 6. So the good thing about this is that we can quickly go to, well, we made a mistake. Let's check unit test, and in particular some of the tests of the integration test and not all the tests, because they would take like tens of minutes to run. Okay, so this one, a file, if you remember when we start talking about pipelines, we are building YAML files. What we are seeing here is the GitHub Action YAML file. In particular, I took a snippet about how these jobs look like. So as a summary, we say GitHub Actions knows about jobs and CodePipeline knows about build spec. So here in this snippet, we have a test integration, which is a job that take care about the integration test. And commonly in our project, they are located here in a hidden folder named GitHub Workflows, and with the name of the pipeline, which in this case is AWS. What I want to highlight here are three main things. First, we create services into the pipeline. We can create services that be a DB, a queue, or whatever service that we want to run within the pipeline to run something. Then we create dependency through the jobs, like creating in parallel or in a sequence mode. So I want to highlight those. So if you see here, we have a job with the name test integration. The plan here is to run the integration test. So as we talk, to run the integration test, we need a test database so we can create our mocks. So what GitHub Actions offer us is a section with the service where we can declare service with the name DB, similar than we are doing through a Docker Compose file. We are describing here a Docker image with a version, some environment variables to have a user password. And in this case, we are enabled the test DB. And finally, we can run the integration test since they are configured to use the test DB that we created in the step before. So finally, this is one thing. So we are adding here a DB service in the pipeline to run the integration test. And then if you go to the second job here in the snippet with the name deploy, we are defining that it has some dependencies. The deploy process will run in an Ubuntu image, and as well will depends or needs, they have some dependency about other jobs that we declare on top, that they are unit test, yarn audit, and integration test. Since the integration test and yarn audit is just a command, so I just show here how it looks like. So I want to share here that is the way that you can create another services that your application can use in order to your test. That could be a queue or whatever other service. Then this is the second option that we talk. This is CodePipeline, and CodePipeline knows about the build spec. So in order to implement the same thing in CodePipeline, what I did and I found interesting is we are able to create different build spec with different concerns. So for example, a couple of things. First of all, we are in a main YAML file with the name manifest. The manifest, what it is describing how the code pipeline will be, right? What is the dependencies, the equivalent to the GitHub action file, YAML file. And then if you see, I will try to zoom in here in the main manifest file that describes the code pipeline in AWS. We can see, well, the name of the branch, what is the repository. Here we have a good section that I want to highlight at some point where we can describe some policies that the build spec could need to run. And then here we will have some stages. These stages in particular, the manifest that will allow us to have a section, a page with the name pre-deployment. So before doing an application deployment that probably will go through a CloudFormation template, we'll run a set of field specs. So we will have different processes in virtual machines. Each of these lines have a process that have its own resources and can run in parallel. So here we have a unit test, integration test, and you will see that here in this other option, we have several files that run the integration test, and they are doing like with numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, and so on. So what we are doing here is to split the integration test. Let's say that we have 100 tests. We have running 10 tests by each of those files, and we are running in parallel. So that is to improve the times of the deployment. We are running as well the yarn audits. And here at the bottom, we have the sections to run the migration. And as you see, in a similar way that GitHub Actions, CodePipeline offers a way to create the dependencies through the code builds. So in this case, in order to run the migration and seed, we depend on the yarn audit, the integration test, and the unit test. So that's the way to how we are declaring the pipeline. So at the bottom here, I put as well examples about how those other specs looks like. And just to go to the main key point here, I want to highlight how to run the integration test and the DB, how to run the migration seeds, since I noticed that there are a lot of information here. So first we have our manifest file that declare the code pipeline in AWS. And this other one, what it does is to run an integration test. So as we know, we need to have a container to run them. So this is a little bit blurry, but we have a build spec, which is pretty clean, and it has these stages: install, pre-build, and build, and finally. So what we are doing here is to install the application's dependencies, and as a pre-build stage, what we are doing is to run a container. We run a Docker command. To me, it's like more clear to run just a Docker compose command where we define a DB. And so it's the equivalent line. So if you remember, we talked in GitHub Action, we have a section in the YAML file where we can describe services. We don't have this option here in the code pipeline. So what we are doing is to just invoke Docker or Docker compose. By the way, build spec will offer us out of the box the Docker command, so we can manage and do these kind of things. Because of that, we are not seeing here Docker install, or we are not installing Docker. It's not needed. And then when we go to the build spec, we are doing two things that I want to highlight. First, since we are starting a service, Here I with the restriction to wait for the service to be up and running. So what we are doing here is to start a service through Docker. Then when we want to run the integration test, let's wait for the service to be up and running. So we'll take a time, and then just run the integration test. In this particular example, we are using just to run the integration test. And I noticed that these kind of tools offer us the way to split in yards, in groups of tests, all the tests that we have, and we can, and for example, if we want to split all the integration tests in 10 groups, and the group is the equivalent to yard, it's a matter to include this parameter where we are saying we want to run in this process the first 10 tests of a group of 10. In that way, this particular process will be fast because we'll use less time to run. Instead of running like 100 tests sequentially, we'll run 10 tests, 10 tests, 10 tests, and so on in a dynamic amount of process, let's say. And finally, as a good practice, if we start a container, it's into the service. But at the end, since we have a virtual machine to run the build spec, it will just shut down. But I think it looks nice to have that step there. So that's one thing related to integration test. Then let's go directly to this other build spec. We are coming from the CodePipeline manifest here on top. And at some point, we will run the migrations when we know that all the tests are going fine. In order to do that, usually depends on the framework that you are using or the language, the command will change. So in this case, I use npx and Prisma ORM, but you can probably have a different ORM. So at the end, the commands are pretty simple. We are installing the dependency for application and we are running the migration and see it. That's it. And if you see on top of the build spec file, you will see here that we are ingesting to this build spec the coordinates. So the build spec is aware about where the DB lives for that environment, right? Because if you remember one of the first slides, we have like staging, development, production. Each environment will have his own database with his own credentials and his own URL. So since our environments are using a secret manager, they can use secret manager or parameter store, but in some way we need to ingest and inform to the build spec where the database lives, so he's aware about where to run the migration command. So far so good. This is the option to run the code pipeline. As a side note, if you are using or familiar with AWS CodePilot, this structure, it's related to code pipeline, but as well is if we are using AWS CodePilot and creating a pipeline through this CLI, we'll create this template for you. And the default place to store these files in the same way that we have on top the GitHub workflow will be Copilot pipelines, the name of the app, and the manifest file. This is the way where the file lives in our projects. So since we didn't talk about any application structure or topology or design, we can have like ECS, lambdas, we can have queues, SNS, we have, different application or different services. That what we are talking here is no matter the application topology. What we want to do here is to run migrations in SAMDB. So since we are talking about code pipeline, we say that we have a code pipeline here on top. The code pipeline, what it has is a set of build specs. What we see here is that there are many. We have test, integration test build, unit test build, migration build, and as well a deployment build. So in particular, I want to highlight two things here. First, as we saw, the integration test is able to create container process services within the build spec to Docker or Docker Compose, and to run the migrations here in order to make this configuration happen. As we know, if we want to run the migration, we need to have some privilege and permissions. So in this example, we are working with MySQL RDS here. Let me zoom in. And we have as well the build spec that it will be charged to run the migration on C. So in order to have this happen, we have a couple of ingredients that we will need. So first, the build spec we will need to give the spec to have the permissions to read secrets from the secret manager or parameter store. Since there is the place where we are storing the DB URL and the DB credential. So what we need to do is to create a role that will have a policy attached to it, where the policy will say something like, well, the permissions to get from the secret manager or the parameter store. And as well, we will need to grant access to the DB. We will need to say something like, you have right permissions to the DB. That is in terms of the policy. So we will have a policy that allows to the build to make these two main actions: get secret and DB. And in particular, in terms of a network perspective, these two services, the build and the RDS, needs to live in the same VPC. So the requirement here will be, the start point will be to have an RDS. For RDS, we will live in a subnet group, and the subnet group, of course, will belong to a VPC. So here, in order to make this connection happen, what we need to do once we have the build spec, we have a security group, and the build spec will live in the same subnet group that the DB lives. So here we have the scope of a VPC. Inside of VPC, we have a subnet group, and there is where the build and the RDS lives. So we have like three main requirements to run migration. We have the role, we have policies, we have a network configuration that we need to have here to make the migration happen. And as third option and requirement, we will need to create a rule in a security group of the RDS saying something like the build spec security group is allowed to make connections to the port, whatever DB port we are using. So here we have an example about how it looks. Here we have a security group of the DB, and we are saying like we are accepting connections into the port from the security group of the build. So with these three permissions, we are able to give the build the privilege to run the migration. So behind the scenes, we have something. If we are going to build spec about how to run the migration, it's pretty simple. Prisma or whatever tool that you are using to run the migration, but behind the scenes, we need to have a policy, we need to have a network configuration, and we need to have permissions in the security group that will work as a whitelist in the network. And finally, we'll talk about the same feature about the communication when we are done. So here I put like this line here that to split the test through the deployment, you will see that here we have a notification rule. So AWS offer to create a notification rule pretty simple through a couple of clicks, where we can create an application that is attached to a Slack channel. So that is pretty straightforward. So in this way, we cover as a summary two types of pipelines definitions. We are covering GitHub Actions and CodePipeline, and we are doing some parallelisms to understand how can we do and what pros or cons, let's say. between them. But at the end, we are covering and going back through these main highlights. So with all this configuration, depends on the environment that we have, the branches and the type of environment. We are sure that every time that we are sending code through our application, we are running all this stuff. So at the end, we will improve the code quality, the delivery, and we are know that at least what we are delivering is free of errors, will be automatically, no matter if it's a feature environment or an unstable environment like staging or development. We will reduce the deployment times, since instead of waiting for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes to run the integration test, we can go in 2 or 3 or 5 minutes. So the deployment will go faster. As well, we talk about it because it's not so important in terms of functionality, but we can enable as well for the build spec, the build cache. So in this case, we avoid to download every time all the application dependency or Docker images. But as well, this step is important to in the scope to reduce the deployment time. We are improving the error handling, since, for example, here we know that some subset of integration tests were failing. So instead of waiting for 20 minutes to run all the integration tests, we can just in a couple of seconds go directly to the place where we're failing. And at the end, we improve the communication, because after or behind all this process in all the pipelines on all the environment, we have some simple Slack channel where we are receiving all these notifications. So we would say like the station was deployed, development was deployed, or a feature environment was deployed. And as well, if someone the team will be aware about it. Hope you
Thanks,
find it
Jose.
interesting. Thank you.